Welcome to Bible Study with the Elkins Park Presbyterian Church. I'm glad you've chosen to join us. This is part 3 in a series on reflections on our American heritage, where I'm sharing learnings from this summer's continuing education time I spent in New England, where I was visiting presidential historical sites, as well as the site of the Pilgrims and some other historical landmarks, as we share how this rich history of our American identity maybe overlaps with our Christian faith, as well as some misconceptions about the way that Christians have lived out our American identity. We come together for this study series. I encourage you, if you've missed a previous part of this series, to go back and watch the videos. They can be found on the Elkins Park Presbyterian Church Facebook page. You can also find them on our website, eppchurch.org, or our YouTube channel. As we turn to our discussion today about FDR and his wife Eleanor, please join me in prayer. Creator God, we are so grateful that you have equipped and called leaders in every generation, across time and place and people, across language, ethnicity, and governance structure. You have led leaders to not necessarily be perfect people, but to be aware of your hand upon them as they do their best to guide your people towards prosperity, wholeness, and towards an identity of being your children. We ask God, as we look now at another American president and his wife, that you guide us to be aware that presidents, politicians, governors, mayors, student council leaders, leaders in our church, elders and deacons, that none of us is perfect, but all of us is beloved. And as we attempt to be obedient to you, may your Spirit lead us in ways that allow the people who we serve to respect us and to find counsel in our leadership. We ask this all giving thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. Today, talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor. Now, I'll admit, most of what I know about FDR is kind of what the whole world knows about him. That he was a president who was somewhat disabled due to polio, that he wore leg braces, that he often was found in a wheelchair, that he liked to address the public, that he was very good at communicating, that his wife Eleanor was very prominent and unique as a first lady in that she endeavored to do a lot of social justice and politics work, a lot of work to raise women in society in parts of leadership and education and opportunity, even after her husband's death and after her official role as First Lady. So all that being said, there's many other things that I learned about FDR when I visited his presidential library in Hyde Park, as well as the burial site of Franklin and his wife Eleanor, and then the home that Eleanor lived in after Franklin's death. All are located in Hyde Park, New York, which is not too far from Poughkeepsie. And if you'd like to visit, they're all National Historical Sites through the National Park Service. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as president 4 times. He ended up being our longest tenured president. That is rather unique. And during his tenure, of course, he oversaw the Great Depression, the time of the New Deal, and our entrance into World War II. So these are significant events in American and world history. When Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office, he did so with his hand on the same family Bible all 4 times, open to the page that has this passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13. Now the translation Franklin used read this way: "And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these 3. But the greatest is charity." Now, in many translations that are more modern that we use in worship today, we say the greatest of these is faith, hope, and love, and then lift love above the other ones. It's interesting, though, that his translation, instead of love, uses the word charity. And we know that he was focused, especially in the New Deal and some other efforts of his presidency, on being what we would call today labeled a progressive or a liberal Democrat. A lot of social interaction from the government, creating things where it put the people to work, but they were on the government payroll. Now, in hindsight, some people see positives in that, and some people see negatives in that. It was his intent, though, he believed as a faithful Christian, that putting the people to work to take care of the needs of their own country and helping their own neighbors was a positive venture and a positive way to use the money and to use the energy that the country had at that point in the fact that they had available workers. But as we look at that system, we know that that can sometimes lead to the abuse of workers by the government or the loss of small independent business and entrepreneurs because the government is employing everybody. And at some point, the government's money to pay those workers will fall below what it needs to. But in the short term, it does provide employment, work, and much needed infrastructure improvements for the nation. So as with any decision made in politics that has to apply to every American citizen, there are certainly positives and negatives for each individual and for the community and nation as a whole. But he endeavored to do things that he saw as progress for the good of the common person, the citizen on the streets, the blue-collar kind of worker. FDR was famous for giving a speech in which he identified 4 freedoms that he believed every individual, not just American citizens, but every individual in God's creation deserved to have. These 4 freedoms were the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. Now, FDR emphasized this second freedom, the freedom of every person to worship God in his or her own way everywhere in the world, to be equal to the freedom of speech, the freedom from want, so having enough, you're having your daily bread, and the freedom from fear, so living in safety and security wherever you are. So he lifted up speech, religious freedom, sustainability, and safety as the freedoms that he saw as most important. FDR is also unique in that because of the circumstances of the world when he was president, he found himself having to partner up with national leaders around the world at a time of crisis. So on January 1st of 1942, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, the Soviet Foreign Minister Litvinov, and Chinese Ambassador Sun met together in the White House to sign a declaration. Now, FDR penned this declaration in which each of these 4 national leaders pledged to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice. Now, today we might argue whether the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, and the People's Republic of China all still live by these words. But on that day in 1942, they pledged to defend life, liberty, independence, and religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice. Eventually, 22 additional nations signed this pledge, giving birth to what Roosevelt coined and called the United Nations. So there's much that happened during FDR's 4 terms as president that resulted in impacts for the global community and for the history of mankind that still have impact on our lives today. It's also important to realize that FDR was the first president to have a presidential library. And maybe even more uniquely than that, when he opened the presidential library, he was still president and had an office in it. And he liked that people would come and visit the presidential library to look at the history of his presidency that was still happening. They would come around the corner and there would FDR be sitting at his desk doing presidential work. So people would kind of come through on a tour, look at historical documents, photos, things from his early presidency, and then there would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt sitting at a desk, penning another letter to a dignitary or a leader around the world, continuing to create that history. When FDR was president, in addition to creating the first presidential library, he also set up the National Archives, which now exists to keep a record of all presidential documents, political correspondence, records of images and audio and video, so that our nation can preserve her history. When FDR opened his library, he said, "It seems to me that the dedication of this library is in itself an act of faith." So although before visiting his library, I didn't necessarily think of FDR as being a faith leader or an outspoken Christian, much of what he does in his 4 terms as president was done out of the ambition and the gratitude for his own faith and the desire to see religious freedom not only here in the United States but around the world, so that people could worship openly and freely without objection from their government, whether or not they be worshiping the one true God as revealed in Jesus Christ, or worshiping in other ways. FDR found great value in that openness and freedom, and the ability it allowed for diplomacy between nations when there wasn't religious persecution occurring or religious elitism occurring. So again, for FDR, that important Bible verse from 1 Corinthians 13:13, that above all of these for him was charity, or maybe in your translation, love, as the highest freedom or virtue of Christian life. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, after FDR's death, he died while serving in office unexpectedly, she went across the street from their home together to a place that had been kind of like a summer home, another home that had a pool and some outbuildings and a playhouse and an artisan's workshop on the campus. And she, along with close friends and confidants and other leaders in the social justice movement of her time, met for another 2 decades there, rallying people of like-mindedness to their causes and ambitions, finding resources, and putting the common man, the everyday worker, in a place of prominence where they had a voice. And although Eleanor was wealthy and obviously a former first lady, had a lot of power, she surrounded herself with those she saw to be just normal everyday citizens, to listen to them and to be their voice, to be an activist on their behalf. So even after FDR's presidency, his wife Eleanor continued to reach out in this way that was very open and inviting, and that called for all people, no matter their station in life or their gender or their economics or whatever profession they held, to be seen as a person of value and worth, which certainly affirms our Christian teaching that all individuals are made in the eyes of God, unique and beloved. Thank you for joining me again for this opportunity for a reflection on our American heritage and how it relates to our faith. This is part 3 in our series. I encourage you to join me again next week. If you'd like to worship with us at the Elkins Park Presbyterian Church here in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, we worship in person in this sanctuary at 10:30 a.m. every Sunday. We also record our worship services for later broadcast. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. You can find us at eppchurch.org or call our church office at 215-887-2544. Thank you, and I hope you can join us again next time.